Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 14th, 2010, and my guest is Matt Ridley. His latest book is The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves. Matt, welcome to EconTalk.
Russ, it's great to be on the show.
So your book is a remarkably ambitious and really an extraordinary achievement in both depth and breadth. You try to do something that is just a little bit beyond modest. You try to explain all of human history around a small slice of what we might want to know about, and you provocatively leverage the idea that trade, the ability to exchange, and the subsequent division of labor that ensues can explain much of human development going back really thousands of years.
Yes, one of my ambitions is to try and take the notion of trade a lot further back into prehistory than people generally do. There's been a tendency among anthropologists and archaeologists to say that, look, you can't do trade until you've invented law and order and government and farming and things like that. And I think the evidence suggests that simply isn't true, that hunter-gatherers are perfectly good at trading and that it had a crucial impact on human history. But my other ambition is to say, look, this is actually the grand theme of human history. Forget the wars and the poets and the culture, etc. And those are all important. But the thing that's running through human history all the time is this tendency to divide labor on a big scale, and sometimes it shrinks again to a small scale. But gradually, inexorably, ratchet-like, it grows until we include everybody in this habit of getting other people to do things for us and doing things for other people. And working for each other is the great theme of human history. That comes about through exchange in a local way, but it comes about through trade on a wider scale.
Adam Smith, of course, talked about the human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. And you point out, as he did, that animals generally, there's reciprocity among animals, but there is not trade. What's the difference?
Yeah, this is a point that I have trouble getting across to people, and therefore I'm obviously not persuasive enough yet, but I feel very strongly about this, which is that reciprocity, which was a theme that very much featured in my previous book, The Origins of Virtue, is indeed something you can find animal models for, animal roots for, because you can find primates, apes, baboons, things like that indulge in reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Dolphins, vampire bats, there's lots of these examples. They don't actually turn out to be all that interesting in terms of explaining the social behavior of animals, but it's a theme. And it's a theme of our story too. Now, I think it's different from what I'm talking about, because what it is reciprocity is, I do you a favor today, you do me the same favor tomorrow. So it's the same thing being exchanged at different times. Now, what I'm talking about is different things being exchanged at the same time. So in other words, I give you bread if you give me money, or I give you a fish if you give me a fruit, or whatever it might be. And because it's simultaneous, you don't have this problem of defection, the problem that I could take the favor today and not return it tomorrow. So in that sense, it ought to be easier to evolve. And yet, you simply cannot find an animal that does this. There is one partial exception, which is there are some insects and some birds which trade food for sex. Basically, if the male brings food, then the female will allow him to mate. But apart from, but in terms of, outside the pair bond, as it were, you can't find examples. As Adam Smith also said, no man ever saw a dog make fair exchange of a bone with another dog. And I got this idea, like a lot of my ideas, straight from Adam Smith. I was very struck by that, the sort of zoological aspect of Adam Smith's, the first book of The Wealth of Nations, is a very scientific, very psychological, very anthropological book in a way, as well as being about economics. You simply don't find another animal that ever goes around saying, here's one object, you can have it if I can have the object you have. Interestingly, there's a brilliant scientist called Sarah Brosnan who's been working on this in chimpanzees. And she's been trying to get barter going in chimpanzee colonies, and she can do it. She can get chimpanzees to barter tokens for food and things like that. And to barter one thing for another, but only using human mediation. They simply just don't get it. It doesn't click in their heads. They don't want to give up something they value, even if it means they can get something they value more. They say, I want to hang on to this. I just want that off you, if you see what I mean.
Sure.
At some point in human history, we crossed that threshold, and we realized that if you give up this thing, which I want this thing. It's not that I don't want the fish I've got, but I want the fruit that you've got more, and you happen to be in the opposite position because you've been eating fruit all morning and haven't had a fish yet.
It also requires a different leap of faith for the trader than the reciprocity leap of faith that you'll come back and scratch my back tomorrow. And I just, thinking about trade it's such a rich and complicated subject. It seems so simple. I give you something, you give me something. You give me something I don't have, I give you something you don't have. But when you think about it, as you just pointed out, it's not just that I'm going to give up something that I like to get something that I want more. As a result of that trade, as you emphasize over and over again, we're going to specialize if we really want to exploit this opportunity to trade. So think how scary it is. I'm going to only make one thing. I like two things or maybe 10 things, but I'm only going to make one in the expectation and hope. And this is what we all do in our trading, in the expectation and hope that someone else will want it and will give me the other things I don't have. That requires me to assume that eventually someone will come along with those desires who likes my stuff and who has stuff that I want. Before money, that barter problem is a real problem. Yeah. And that they'll feel the same way I do. They'll take that risk to swap. And you're really right in emphasizing that is, you can see in the animal world, right? If you spend all your time doing one thing, if you didn't get those trading partners, you're going to die.
Absolutely. And this, how we navigated this move away from self-sufficiency. And by the way, people say self-sufficiency is security and we need food security and oil security and all these kind of things. Actually, self-sufficiency is terrifically vulnerable. I mean, look at what happened when countries had to grow their own food in the Middle Ages. One bad harvest and everybody's starving. Whereas now, one bad harvest and the price adjusts and food flows around the world and everybody gets a bit. And, some people suffer if the price goes up too much, but you don't get starvation, at least not on a wide scale. Sorry. So, yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say on the animal thing, the other thing I wanted to mention, and the pair bond is very important because in the animal world, because there is specialization in the animal world. You do have the sexual division of labor, right? You have everywhere. You have people who specialize, but only in the family.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you have, I tell you what you have the reproductive division of labor a lot, and that's the one we don't have. Ironically, in other words, in ants, you have let's leave the reproducing to the queen. We'll do the working. She does the reproducing.
Right.
And you have that in honeybees and naked mole rats and termites and all these kind of things. And it's a brilliant system. It means you can build up these giant families, which we call colonies, which work very well, and they have divisions of labor with them. Sometimes really quite sophisticated divisions of labor between different kinds of workers and soldiers versus workers and that kind of thing. But they can never go beyond the colony. The division of labor is confined to the colony, which is basically, as I say, a big family, because it's based on this reproductive division of labor. And I like to joke that, reproductive division of labor, reproductive specialization is the one thing we don't like to do. It's the one thing we insist on being self-sufficient in.
Yes, we do.
I'm not happy to find that my queen is doing all the reproducing for me, even in England. Ha ha. And so But the sexual division of labor, which is the phrase anthropologists use for male hunting versus female gathering and the sharing that then follows, that's a pretty uniquely human thing. Now, you do get species in which the two sexes specialize in terms of hunting, but they don't often do a lot of sharing afterwards.
Well, that's very interesting.
So, actually, the idea that I go hunting for meat and you go, and my wife goes digging for roots, and we then come back and share, may be the oldest example of a gain from trade, of a real Ricardian or Smithian gain from trade, because when you think about it, it's a beautiful system on the African savanna, because it means that if I'm a male, my chances of coming back with a dead warthog are pretty low. I mean, there's a lot of days I'm going to come back empty-handed. How am I going to feed on such a day? Well, I can rely on the fact that my wife is digging up some roots, so there's bound to be something to eat. On the other hand, think of it from her point of view. She thinks, well, roots are all very well, but I'd really like some protein from time to time, but I just can't afford the time or risk the effort of going hunting, particularly when I've got kids that you have to look after or something. Tell you what, I'm in a beautiful situation because he can go hunting. All I have to do is if I want warthog meat, all I've got to do is dig some extra roots, and then I've got something to trade for warthog meat. So both sides benefit from the exchange.
So the book opens with a really extraordinary chapter that I'm now adding to my pantheon of my favorite collections of how much life has changed. You start off by saying life's a lot better than it was 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 years ago, but it's even a lot better than 100 years ago, something I've written about. It's a lot better than 50 years ago, and we find it so difficult to appreciate that incredible transformation. And so underlying, we're going to come back and talk about trade a lot more, but I want to put that in the context that you do at the beginning of the book, which is the optimism, the idea that, and I heard James Buchanan say this beautifully the other day, a colleague here at George Mason. He said, when I look to the future, I get very nervous, talking about the current economic situation. He said, but when I look to the past, I feel pretty good, because there were a lot of times when things look bleak. You take the Great Depression, just to take a relatively modern example, right? If you were alive in 1933 when unemployment was 25%, your forecast for where the United States economy was going in the next 20 to 30 years would be very, very bleak. It turned out to be a very bad prediction. It turned out, of course, that we recovered fairly quickly. There was a lot of suffering and hardship. But the long-run trend is so gloriously positive, and it's so easy to forget that. So I want to let you talk about that first, then we'll talk more about trade. Talk about your underlying optimism.
Yeah, well, this is, for me, I became an adult in the 1970s. I was, 21 in 1979. That was a pretty depressing decade in many ways, particularly if you're in Britain. We basically considered ourselves to be in decline, and we turned the lights off 2 days a week or whatever. But it wasn't just Britain. The population explosion was said to be out of control. Famine was inevitable. A cancer epidemic caused by chemicals in the environment was going to shorten our lives. Our sperm counts were supposed to be going to falling. The acid rain was going to kill the forest. The desert was advancing at 2 miles a year.
Unemployment was high. Inflation was high.
Unemployment was rising. The oil was going to run out. And we were going to have to get used to negative growth or whatever. Nobody ever said anything to me about how the future was going to be great. They literally just never even discussed it. At least the grown-ups didn't. And so over the next 2 decades, as I watched my country snap out of recession, have a pretty tidy boom that actually was pretty well spread through society, and I saw the rest of the world do the same, and then I saw China and India take off, and an extraordinary reduction in poverty, illiteracy, ill health,
hundreds of millions of people. It wasn't just like, well, this little corner, they caught on to something and they did a little better. It's a glorious 25 years.
It's an incredible story. And not only that, people became healthier, wealthier, wiser. They lived longer. They became freer. and they became more equal. You know, what I did was I simply went and looked up the numbers. I said, okay, I've suddenly realized that actually the world's always been getting better and everybody's always been saying it's about to get worse. And so let's go and look up the numbers. And I was amazed by the numbers. You know, I mean, lifespan up 1/3 in my lifetime, globally. I'm not talking about, any one country here. Per capita income trebled in my lifetime in real terms. That includes Africa, and, this is at a time when the population has doubled. So there's this thing called prosperity, and it's actually growing. And I'm not saying, and by the way, people occasionally accuse me of being Dr. Pangloss, that this is the best of all possible worlds. That's exactly what I'm not saying. I'm saying, hey, don't you dare try and stop now, because this is still a vale of tears. Do you realize just how much richer we could get if we really pushed forward the human experiment? How many people we could still get out of poverty? I find there's a council of despair about issues like Africa. I find people saying, well, Africa's never going to be able to get rich. They said that about India 30 years ago, and, it's not rich yet, but it's on the way. This has become, as you can tell from the tone of my voice, an evangelical issue for me.
Yeah, me too. I have the same issues.
I want to spread the good news, or at least the news about how good it could get. And I find nobody knows. Everybody thinks that we're no richer than when they were born. They forget that they live longer than when they were born. They forget that the population growth rate has fallen or something. You know what I mean? They just don't hear the good news.
Well, part of it is they literally don't hear it. It's obviously not the focus of most news coverage, and it's also the fact of what the human brain focuses on. It's why we like horror movies, I guess. I don't fully understand it. We did a program.
I don't fully understand it either, and it's the question that people ask me most, and it's the one I have a least satisfactory answer to it. I mean, I have sort of evolutionary psychology just so stories to tell people about how, focusing on things that might go wrong is probably more rewarding than being complacent about the world. But I still find the fascination with pessimism very surprising. And there's a wonderful quote from H.G. Wells, which I put in my book, which is that the man who despairs when others hope is regarded by a large class of persons as a sage. Why is that? I don't know.
Yeah, that is...
You just sound wiser if you're gloomy, don't you?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a fascinating thing. And there's nothing wrong with being gloomy right now in 2010. It doesn't look. We got all kinds of other political, economic problems that loom. But as you point out, if you step back just a titch from the canvas, the perspective is pretty cheerful.
Well, exactly, and I don't want to sort of belittle the problems people have. Absolutely not. And part of my ambition is just to get people to be ambitious about solving problems rather than, I don't want people to go around saying life's great or anything. We take things for granted. That's the funny thing. There's some hilarious examples of this, like, cursing the fact that you can't get a signal on your mobile phone or that your flight across the Atlantic is delayed by 1 hour.
We just talked about this with Alain de Botton a couple podcasts ago. Yeah, it's an amazing thing. We take it for granted, and we get furious when the world doesn't work the way we couldn't have imagined it working 10 years ago. It's not just like 100 years. It's 10 years ago we couldn't have imagined what we have now, and we're very ungrateful. Right. We're very unappreciative.
And we say, I hate supermarkets. I mean, come on, somebody is chopping and washing salad and packing it so it's beautifully fresh, especially for me, and finding a way of charging me almost nothing for it. Why are they doing that? It's very nice of them.
Well, of course, they're not doing it out of love. They're doing it out of self-interest, as we'll get to. And before I forget, I want to mention we did have a podcast on ant colony specialization with Deborah Gordon, an ant expert, which we'll put a link up to, which is one of my personal favorites. Not maybe every listener liked it as much as I did, but
listen to that one.
This distinction between human and animal specialization, division labor, fascinates me. Let's get to a criticism one could make of your thesis of optimism, which I'm sure you've heard. I'd love to get your response, which is sustainability. So the standard view what you've just said is something many economists, not too many, but some economists believe, that things not only are getting better, but they will continue to get better. One of the arguments against that isn't just, well, but what about the financial crisis? Because we can imagine that we'll get by. It may take 5 years, 10 years, 3 months. We have no idea. But we can imagine, as in the Great Depression, we'll put it behind us at some point. What about the limits that other people worry about, that we're reducing the resource base of the planet, the oil? Okay, in 1978, we were overly pessimistic, but ultimately these are finite resources. Along with global warming, we're eventually going to have trouble sustaining not just the growth rate, but maybe growth at all, and we may, some say, plunge into a much darker era. What's your argument against that, if you have one?
Yeah, well, my argument against that is that it completely misunderstands the nature of what we do with resources. For a start, we do more with less. I mean, that's the nature of growth, is to get more energy out of each gallon of oil we burn or something, by devising more efficient cars or whatever it is. So our rate of use of resources per work we get out of them is always is improving all the time. And secondly, if you look at the human footprint on the land, how much of the landscape are we needing for our uses? It's very, very interesting. It keeps going down. And what I mean by that is that back in the 19th century, before we'd invented synthetic fertilizers, we had to raid more and more land because our population was going up. And, thank goodness for the American prairies and the Argentinian pampas and the steppes of Russia, because if we hadn't been able to plow those, then there would have been mass starvation as the population expanded in Europe. And we exported people and we imported corn, and we just kept going that way. And around 1900, a guy stood up and made a speech, a guy called Sir William Crookes, and said, we've got a wheat problem. We're going to run out of wheat. We're going to run out of land to grow wheat on, and we're all going to starve. Well, about 10 years later, somebody invented the Haber invented the Haber process, which is essentially a way of getting the nitrogen that's in the air and using it as fertilizer and increasing the productivity of land. And the result of that is that now we've quadrupled the population in this century just ended, and we've pretty well extinguished starvation at the same time, and we've slightly reduced the amount of land under the plow. And we've returned a lot of land to forest in places like the eastern seaboard of North America, for example. If we were to continue doing that in the next century, when the population isn't going to rise so fast, when it's only going to go up 1.5 times in this century instead of 4 times as in the last century, then we could imagine feeding the world from a much smaller acreage today, when there's 9 billion people, at a much higher standard, with plenty of meat for everybody, by the end of this century. And actually, the rainforests would be bigger, not smaller. Now, somebody will say, well, yes, but okay, that's at the expense of using methane, natural gas, which is what we use to make nitrogen fertilizer, because it's the energy from the methane that goes into converting the nitrogen into a form we can use. Well, yes, but we're getting our energy now from a hole in the ground, from methane, or coal mines and oil wells and so on. That means we don't have to get it as we used to have to get it from the landscape. We used to have to get it from the forests. We used to have to get it from the streams. We used to have to get it from the wind. These were the ways we powered civilization before. Now we can let the forests grow and rot and support beetles and birds and things like that, because we don't need so much wood to support our lifestyles. And we can let the streams run free and fill up with salmon again, because we don't need to dam them every 10 miles, as happened in, every stream in Britain was basically dammed everywhere possible by the end of the Middle Ages, to make mills to do work for human beings. So my argument is that actually we've kind of got this upside down. In many ways, we're reducing our impact on the land. I mean, just imagine if we were hunter-gatherers. We would have to go back. If we went back to being hunter-gatherers, you and me, we'd need 1,000 hectares each to support our lifestyle. Well, if everybody in Manhattan tried that, there's not going to be a lot of wildlife left in North America. So in many ways, our impact on the planet can get less because of growth. Growth is the very thing that can make civilization sustainable. The more we move forward, the more sustainable we're going to be.
Well, you sound
we're not going to run. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, you sound kind of Dr. Panglossian there, and I have to say, since I share your view, I have to indict myself as well. So let me give the counterpoint view, which is, by the way, your point about the rivers running free and the trees growing as we go below ground is really a gorgeous point. But the skeptic would say, okay, but we've scarred the earth, we've strip mined the coal, we've in turn unleashed all this carbon. And my counter, and you give yours, my counter is we get, as you say, we get better and better at using any 1 gallon of crude oil. Any 1 ton of coal is cleaner and more efficient than it used to be. And there's no reason to think that process will ever stop.
That's right. And people talk about us, as it were, using up the copper and using up the steel and using up the chrome and using up the uranium or whatever on the planet. And the phosphate, phosphorus is an element that we have to mine to support our agriculture, and that the high concentration ores of phosphorus are kind of running out at the moment. But the low concentration ones are not, and they're all over the world. They're pretty well infinite. And it turns out that there is not a single example of a non-renewable resource that has run out. Nobody's run out of stone in the Stone Age, or iron in the Iron Age, or bronze in the Bronze Age. Do you see what I mean? That's not why these ages peter out. It's because we move on to something else. Whereas renewable resources have a nasty tendency to run out. Whales, passenger pigeons,
the buffalo.
They can go extinct. White pine forests, etc. So the obsession with moving to so-called renewable resources seems to me a bit weird. The phosphorus that we use in agriculture gets washed down our river and ends up in our estuaries. At some point, we'll mine the mud of our estuaries to get it back again if we need to.
There's a great passage in the book about the evolution from guano bird droppings to synthetically produced fertilizer, which you just alluded to, and it's a beautiful example of how it looked like, it was hopeless. That prophecy in 1900 that we were going to starve to death because we wouldn't have any more fertilizer because we'd used up all the bird droppings. It was the peak bird dropping problem. Eventually, we're going to be running out. It just misunderstands the nature of creativity. And of course, Julian Simon is written eloquently on this.
Absolutely, and I need to pay tribute to a lot of people who've got me thinking the right way on this, and Julian Simon is one, you're another, but, and by the way, I have to throw in a plug for The Choice and also The Invisible Heart, two just fabulous novels that explain this much better than I could. I do think that the resource point, so there's one resource which at the moment people are worried that we're using up, and I can't yet prove that we're not, and that's the capacity of the atmosphere for absorbing our emissions. We've actually got better, of course, at the other kinds of emissions, sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide and all these kind of things that come out from car exhaust. A car is now 99% cleaner per mile traveled than it was in my youth, in about 1970. So that's why you don't have smogs in Pasadena to the extent that you did 30 years ago.
You can actually see the mountains.
Can we do the same with carbon? Well, we're working on it. I suspect we're about to see a major shift to using a lot more natural gas in the next few decades instead of coal and oil for generating electricity because of the shale gas revolution. Natural gas has, I think, a quarter as much carbon per energy, as it were, as coal does. So that shift would be a pretty radical decarbonization, darn sight more effective than building wind turbines, which doesn't reduce carbon emissions at all because of the backup problem. I think we are working on decarbonizing our economy. can we do it fast enough before it damages the climate? Well, I've had a hard look at climate science, and I can see a definite evidence that we might be doing something to the climate through carbon emissions that is slow and mild. I cannot see evidence that we're doing anything that is fast and dangerous yet. And I think we've got plenty of time to work on this problem. I suspect we'll give up fossil fuels before they even run out. People often say to me, well, if you don't believe in climate change, surely you recognize fossil fuels are going to run out. And I reply to them, well, if fossil fuels are going to run out, why are you worried about climate change?
Yeah, well, they should be, because we'll start burning those forests down. But unless we get used to being very cold, which is not one of our favorite things.
Not in the north of England.
No. Let's turn to. Let me raise a different question. Your book is really as I said, an extraordinarily ambitious panoramic look at really the evolution of human development. You start with the hunter-gatherer, you go through agriculture, you go through the move to cities, you go to industrialization, you come to the modern world, and running through that story is the power of trade. And I've thought a lot about this as a student of Ricardo and Smith, and I did a podcast on some of these issues. We'll put a link up to. The puzzle I have as a longtime fan of Ricardo, and Ricardo's theme, which you use many times in the book, is that differences between us allow us to get more than we could on our own, which of course is a standard economic lesson, not fully absorbed by the public, which I hope your book will help. But here's the problem I have. While we have this evolutionary process of cultural and human change from hunter-gatherer to farmer to urbanization to industrialization to the so-called knowledge economy, through an enormous part of that history, there was very little progress. So while it's true that at the micro level, being able to trade with you, my near neighbor, not just my family member, but my strange neighbor, and then in a city with a bunch of strangers, and then with other before that with other farmers, how it makes me wonder how powerful the force is when in fact most of the improvement in human history took place in the last 250 years. And before that, the overwhelming story is one of getting by. And as a result, I'll give my take on it in a minute. What's yours? How do you reconcile the story of the power of trade with that seemingly undeniable fact?
Yeah, I just had an exchange on the Cato website with Deirdre McCloskey on exactly this, and there are two words that summarize my answer. Really, one is piracy, and the other is fossil fuels. The piracy point first. I think that human history is a competition between the kind of wealth generation that I've talked about and the kind of wealth eating that comes from chiefs, priests, and thieves, predators, parasites, and generally rent seekers, as it were. In other words, there are two ways of, you wake up in the morning and you say, am I going to get rich by exchanging and specializing with someone, or am I going to get rich by pinching someone else's wealth through conquest or
plunder,
subjugation, yep, or whatever it might be? And the story of nearly all trade booms, and this is why I really enjoyed getting into the history of humanity over the last couple of thousand years. The story of all trade booms is that you get wonderful efflorescences of human prosperity, and then someone comes along and eats them. Somebody comes along and eats the fruits, as it were, of it, either by conquering or by bureaucratizing your trading
taxes.
So the Greek diaspora, or the Phoenicians before that, or the Italian city-states, or the Dutch trading position. It's again and again. It's free city-states that create enormous prosperity, and then along comes the Roman Empire, or China's, of course, a wonderful example where when China was fairly decentralized, it became extremely rich and had a huge amount of trade with the world. And then the Ming Empire basically comes along and shuts the whole thing down and says, we're going to regulate everything and we're going to tax everything and we're going to
close our borders, right?
Close our borders, exactly. And in Holland's case, the Dutch had a great thing going in the 17th century. What killed it? Well, basically the fact that they had to keep spending huge fortunes fighting wars against Louis XIV. So I think, I think that, and by the way, you can trace this process back on a different scale, right back to 160,000 years ago. That's one of the beautiful things that's coming out of a archaeological group in University College London, looking at some of these very early explosions of new technologies in Africa, and looking at them in sort of demographic terms. That what's happening here is that there's an increased population density and people are exchanging with each other. They can't prove that piracy is what destroys it, but anyway, that would be my guess, is that, in the end, warfare prevents these breaks apart these civilizations. Now, then I have to admit that there is this weird discontinuity in history, and people like Robin Hanson are very good at reminding me of this, at around 200 years ago. That every boom you could look at, Italy, Venice, Holland, etc., doesn't really work at raising human living standards, because it just gets started and then it kind of grinds to a halt, or the population grows or something. It runs into a Malthusian correction often, that genuinely what happens is the population rises and then you start to get a resource constraint. So what I like is I quite like Greg Clark's analysis that we escape the Malthusian trap that we Brits do first, and then the rest of the world comes barreling through the hole with us. In the 19th century, Britain had a great 18th century. It did a hell of a lot of trade with the world. It kind of took over the Dutch trade. It was lucky because the English Channel meant that it didn't have to build up a big standing army. And it got the trade with East Asia going. It traded with America. It did the slave trade, of course, which is not so beautiful, but there we go. And so you get this growth of Britain in the 18th century, but it wouldn't have gone anywhere. Real living standards for the ordinary wage Brit had not gone up much by the end of the 18th century. And if it had stopped there, then we would talk about it like we talk about those, like ancient Greece or something. But what happened in the early 19th century was we then began to harness fossil fuels. And that meant suddenly we had something that wasn't showing diminishing returns, a source of energy, in a source of amplification of human labor, that you could get more. The more you dug up of this stuff called coal, the cheaper it got. That wasn't true for forests or agricultural land or anything else. They tended to get more expensive the more you used them. And so you get the opposite of diminishing returns. You get increasing returns. Now, that makes me quite old-fashioned, because the theory used to be that coal helped the Industrial Revolution become a permanent thing. And then it kind of has gone out of favor, and everybody is now talking about institutional explanations and things like that. I still, if you look at the graph of human living standards, GDP per capita, it takes a step change 200 years ago, and it starts going up at a much faster rate. I think we need a special explanation for that, and I think it's about getting cheap energy.
Well, it could be. It's hard to know, of course, and Deirdre has her answer, which is very creative, about the idea that it was okay to be bourgeois, that it was it's an interesting idea. I don't know if it's testable. It's a provocative thesis. The way I think about it, I don't have an answer either, but the way I think about it is that if you can only trade with a relatively small number of people, which in primitive times meant a handful, and even in Middle Ages, I like to say, we've tried buy local before, the movement buy local. It's called the Middle Ages, right? In the Middle Ages,
right.
Occasionally a guy would come through from far away and bring you some spices or something you couldn't get nearby. But most of trade, the kind of trade you write a lot about in the book, is division of labor and specialization among a relatively small group of people. So for whatever reason, when prices of transportation fell enough, partly because of coal, partly the steam engine, partly other innovations, you could suddenly trade with a very much larger group of people. And the reason I think that's important, and we totally underappreciate it, and it is a theme in your book, is that took us from a Ricardian world to a Smithian world, where Smith, who talked about the division of labor being limited by the extent of the market, that little cute phrase, which we sometimes talk about, not much, unfortunately, that once we got the opportunity to trade with such a larger group, which is what modernity is, then the process has a life of its own. So the part I struggle with, which I'm challenging you with, is that, and I think I first read this in Robert Lucas's writings, that the technology of farming in 1700 was the same as it was in Rome. And you lived a pretty much the same life in terms of how much protein you could wrest from the earth, how much nutrition you could wrest from the earth, wrest with a W, you could take from the earth. And something changed. And once that changed, suddenly you could get more and more from less and less. And that revolution is the one that can last forever, it looks like.
Absolutely. And I think I do think that's a very perceptive analysis. However, I would caution that we, compared with the modern world, the world of 0 to 1700 AD looks static, but it isn't static in technological terms. There is an accumulation of technologies, and the perfection of the horse collar or whatever that goes on, which may not improve your living standards all that much because of the population goes up or something like that. But an 18th century ship was a darn sight more efficient than a Roman sailing ship.
Fair enough.
So I think it's simply that the graph is going up at a slower rate before that.
Right. That's a good point.
But I do think that your analysis is absolutely right. I think the importance of transport is right. But also I love this point you make about specialization and exchange on a wider scale. Because, of course, the wider the scale, the more it brings you into contact with people who have differences, different preferences, or different capabilities, or different natural endowments. And, of course, the beauty of the Ricardian thing is that the gain from trade is that the more you specialize, the more you've got to exchange, and the more you exchange, the more it pays to specialize. So it really is a virtuous circle.
But the Smith point, which you also write about, which I think is so often forgotten, is the more you specialize, and Mike Munger did a podcast on this topic, and then I did one as a solo. The more you specialize, and this is right out of Smith, the more advantageous it is to apply technology to it and capital. And that's the modern story. It's not so much the story of the past. It's some of it, but it's that opportunity to benefit from the productivity of labor embodied in capital that Smith talks about is really what sets it going crazy. And, I joked with I just got an iPad, and my son sent me an app that he'd like me to have that I'm not interested in, that he finds to be a cool app. And I wrote him back, he's 12, and I said, when you get one in 5 years, when it's a chip that's put under your skin so that when you think about the game, a virtual holographic screen appears in front of you, you can get it then. And, the things that we enjoy today, as I said before, they're not just things that couldn't have been imagined 100 years ago. They couldn't have been imagined 15 years ago. And it makes you wonder what will be available 15 years from now. And there's no reason to think it won't be just as extraordinarily greater.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just had a written exchange with someone this morning about climate, and he's a very senior government advisor on climate, and he was saying, I don't think we should be blasé about even 2 degrees over 200 years. And I replied, are you telling me that someone in 1810 should have used his then technologies to try and influence the world in 2010? Because that's what you're saying, is that I should be doing something today with my existing technologies about the world in 2210. And I'm sorry, but I just think my existing technologies are going to be laughably irrelevant in terms of influencing that world. So, the future is very opaque, always will be, and we have no idea what's just around the corner. By the way, just one point I want to make, talking to you is wonderful on this, Russ, because, I'm learning from people like you all the time. I have no background as an economist. As a reporter, I gradually came to cover more and more economics issues, but in terms of school and university, I never read any economics courses of any kind. I'm totally autodidactic on Smith and Ricardo and that kind of thing, and thanks to people like Ross Roberts. But that, to some extent, that helps me, I think, because it gives me a naivety in asking.
I was going to say, I think that's
questions.
It's a great advantage, probably most of the time. I'm sorry to report. I want to close with an aspect of that, but before we get there, I want to come back to that conversation you just reported, because I think it's so fascinating and such a great example of perhaps some of the explanations for why we're so pessimistic. When someone says we've got to do X, Y, or Z to help people 200 years from now, and you point out just brilliantly that, 200 years ago, can you imagine them thinking about what we would have available to us? It's a lack of imagination. It's being forced because we live in the present and we're not much good at history, and your book helps redress that ignorance. But it's a lack of imagination. It's a fear of the future without taking account anything that we've learned from the past. And as you say, it's a joke. It's laughable. It's inhuman, literally, to not imagine what could be available in 200 years that would make the world a better place, and to think it'll be something like the world we live in. There's no evidence for that thesis. Everything around us tells us overwhelmingly that is the thesis of a child. We expect a child to be unaware of the world of 20 years ago or 100 years ago. But for an adult to say that, which we all do, by the way, I'm not indicting your correspondent, but it's just personally, because we all have this problem, it's hard to step back because, time goes slow for us. But in the scope of human progress, we're looking at a nanosecond.
I think that's very nice, I've lost the train of thought of what I was going to say in response to that, but never mind. I do think that it's a difference between remembering to be dynamic about the future and having a static view. I mean, you think of where we've got to as being a static position, but it isn't. It's always changing, and the possibility of perpetual change is something that we just don't notice. And of course, it's very new for our natures. 300 years ago, you and I could have lived our whole lives and not seen a new technology, I suspect. Somebody might have come along with a new kind of plow to the village we lived in.
Not too different. It'd be somewhat really close to what we had.
Say again?
It wouldn't be much of an improvement. It would be.
That's right.
It wasn't like you said. There were little changes, but.
Whereas now I'm fully, I'm kind of dithering about getting an iPad because I think, I don't want. There's no point getting one now. I'm going to wait for the next generation.
It's possibly a good idea.
One will be along soon, and maybe the black pad will be better. And I don't know what. So we're kind of spoiled in that respect.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. Now, the point I didn't think about.
I know what it was I was going to say. Sorry, and if I've got a second, it's just to throw back at you what is often thrown back at me on that, which is that the past is no guide to the future. The kind of stockbroker argument, just because something's gone up doesn't mean it's going to go on going up. The very fact that a whole series of white swans have just swum past doesn't mean that the next one's not going to be black. And people find this a bit of a killer argument against me.
Yes, they
say,
do.
Look, you're just doing extrapolationism. How do you answer that? I'd be interested to know.
Well, it is it's an accusation. It suggests that there's a dogmatic faith that you and I have, and my colleague Don Boudreau writes about this a lot as well. That somehow the future, just because it's always been brighter, will continue to get brighter, and it often comes up in the exhaustion of natural resources. You gave a very nice sequence there: the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. All those things didn't end because we ran out, but this time it could be different. And why would you think it wouldn't be catastrophic when we, quote, run out of oil? So I do think it is a good idea not to always extrapolate from the past naively, but your extrapolation of mine isn't naive extrapolation. Our optimism about the future isn't because we look at a trend line and say, oh, it's always been getting better, so it probably will keep doing so. It's because we're saying something about the underlying process that produces that improvement. It's not just in winter, it keeps getting colder as we go from September through January. It's getting colder and colder. Oh my gosh, we're entering a new ice age. But no, it doesn't keep going. That's not what we're saying. Once you understand the underlying science of the seasons and climate, you understand it gets warmer again. So when we talk about the reason that we expect it to be better, it's because of the underlying creativity of the human enterprise and the ability to marshal it. So, for example, we're talking about the iPad. It's the biggest model is 64 gigabytes, and in America, that's the 64 gigabyte model is I think it's $699, and it holds a certain amount of stuff. It doesn't have a camera. It doesn't have a video. And you're thinking rationally, maybe I'll wait a little bit till it gets a little better. Now, if I said to you, oh, you're just going to assume it's going to keep getting better? What if it gets worse? Well, that would be a stupid assumption. It's going to get worse, right?
Yeah, I missed your chance.
You missed it. But
it's
why
go
are you
up to $7.99?
Why are you so confident that it's going to that the next generation will be lighter, faster,
right?
Bigger?
Not just because it's gone on getting better before, but because I know there are guys working on improvements, and I know there's a whole industry there trying to find out ways of making it cheaper.
And if it turns out that a better way to communicate with others and integrate your photos and your work life and your music and your diversion comes along, it won't get better. It'll disappear, and it'll be replaced by something better. Now, why am I so confident, which I am, by the way, that something even as marvelous as this working toy is? And I'm 5 days into it, Matt, so I'm a little bit I've got some emotional problems. I'm a little bit addicted to
envious.
it. It's early. I may come out of it. I'm optimistic I'll come out of it, and it'll just be a part of my life like my laptop. But why is it that I think there'll be something better even, and that this iPad in 20 years, the thing I told my son, will look like the cell phone of 1992, which would look like a giant World War II walkie-talkie, right? Why do I know that something better's come along? Oh, is it because I'm just a mindless optimist about the future? No, it's why your book's called The Rational Optimist.
Absolutely.
You know something about what caused the improvement. Now, there are limits, right? We live in the physical world. I don't think people are going to learn how to swing their arms and fly, but they don't have to. They can use an airplane. We find ways to do the unimaginable throughout all of human history, and there's no reason to see that it would stop.
I think that point about the rational being quite an important word in my title is key. When people say, "What do you mean by the rational optimist as opposed to the irrational?" and I say, "Look, I've arrived at optimism through argument, not through." I'm not a particularly cheery sort of person. I mean, at 3 a.m, I'm a pessimist like everyone else. It's just
you have
I look around the world and I say, oh my God, actually, and by the way, it has affected my behavior in life a little bit, writing this book, because whenever I get into these conversations about, oh God, I mean, the trains are getting so unpunctual these days or whatever, these grumpy old men conversations, as we call them in Britain. There's a television series in Britain called Grumpy Old Men, where they get celebrities to sort of moan about what annoys them about the modern world. And it's very funny, really. But anyway, whenever I get into a grumpy old man conversation nowadays, I kick myself and I say to my friends suddenly in the pub, shut up, everything's fine. The train's pretty bloody good. Have you heard how bad it was, 100 years ago or something? They look at me like I've gone mad, of course, but it's fun.
Yeah, it's good for your internal well-being. It's ruining your social life, I'm sure, being the rational optimist. It's not the easiest banner to wave. And of course, when we go through a period like we're going through now, and your book was written in the middle of this, and so it's an interesting perspective.
That's right, and there was a degree to which I was, launching into a headwind.
Yep, and yet
actually that's a good thing to do when you're trying to take off, isn't it? But whatever.
Well, but it's a great point because you look at the mess we're in now, and people say, "Well, it was a good run in America, say for 250 years, but we've got this Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare crisis that we're not going to be able to solve politically." And now, there is truth to that, right? We can ruin our political system with some stupid things. We can do some stupid things that would slow this process that we're talking about down, and we're always at risk of that. Yeah,
the tax eaters may get the upper hand. And yes, by the way, I am pretty struck by how pessimistic America's mood is at the moment. I mean, I've been used all my life to hopping across the Atlantic for instead of taking Prozac, in other words, because you guys tend to cheer us up.
We have fewer grumpy old men. It's we don't breed them as effectively.
Yeah.
Well, I want to close. We're almost out of time. I want to close with an observation, and it came to mind because of your remark about being self-taught. The first great economist, who in some ways your book is an implicit homage to, is Adam Smith, right? So,
absolutely.
So 1776, he comes along and he says a bunch of things that were revolutionary at the time, both from the scope of them, as you talk about. He wasn't just an economist. He wrote about a lot of things. But also he saw things other people didn't see. He made the point that money isn't everything, that mercantilism, that accumulating silver and gold is not the source of the wealth of nations, that the source of our wealth is our skills and what we can produce, not what we count in the counting house. That was one of the first points of that book. He goes on to say, where does it come from? The division of labor, what we're talking about through this hour. And do you find it strange that 236 years or 234 years ago, that book gets written and we don't understand the lesson? Not only that, we don't really teach it in our economics classes. So you say you didn't take any economics class. If you had, you wouldn't learn much about it. We don't spend a lot of time teaching this lesson. How strange is that?
Absolutely. And I can't tell you how many times I've thought about the wealth of nations. What the hell were my school teachers doing not telling me about this? It just sort of, it strikes me between the eyes. This is the most brilliant idea I've ever come across, with the possible exception of Darwin's natural selection, and nobody ever told me about this. And I had to find it out for myself, really quite embarrassingly late in my life. That means, as Hans Rosling once put it in a talk, at least there's something for me to do in the world to evangelize. But the idea that prosperity is accumulation is still out there in spades, and so there's still work for you to do, Ross.
Yeah, you too. Boy, well, thanks for your great contribution in this effort. It's desperately needed.
Well, I tell you, I really appreciate the fact that proper economists like you have taken my amateur effort seriously. But and it's not the last word by any means. But it's just such an exciting game to contribute to.
My guest today has been Matt Ridley. Matt, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.